Thanks a lot for joining again to this session I've been waiting for to moderate all day long, I have to say, because this is about thinking things a little different. With this keynote, Futures a Story, Narratives for Radical Social Transitions, we want to leave a bit the very important areas of institutions and finances at the municipal level. But as Yevgen already said, we want to approach the individual level and ask ourselves what are the competences or literacies needed that we need in order to manage a complex digital and uncertain world. So the input we will hear today from Lazar Dzamic goes to the heart of democracy and our ability to fulfill our democratic duties and in particular self-agency and voice. And for this we need to develop, as we will hear, literacies. So this input is about changing perspective. And I'm very happy that we have the right person who can facilitate this change of perspective, as I personally also experienced in the prep meetings we had, where we swapped immediately from logistical question to the most fundamental questions society is facing at the moment. So Lazar Dzamic is a lecturer in digital marketing. He is at the Faculty for Media and Communications in Belgrade, at Business School Lausanne, and the Economic Faculty in Ljubljana. He's a former head of brand planning in Google's creative think tank, Zoo in London, where he created the strategy team and introduced to the industry two of the world's first creative data scientists. His latest book, The Definitive Guide to Strategic Content Marketing, was published in 2018. But before I pass the floor to you, Lazar, I will just remind all of you that you can ask questions in the chat, in the YouTube channels and in the Facebook, on our Facebook, and I'm happy then to ask these questions to Lazar. And also we have prepared a little poll to get your opinion on where do you think the literacies we will learn about, what kind of literacies you consider most important. So we will have the QR code right now, you can scan it and access the poll. We will also share the link to the poll and the code in the chats on YouTube and Facebook. So thanks a lot. I'm happy that you joined this discussion. And Lazar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Helge. And it's a real privilege to be here with you today. And thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I know that you've been talking a lot about different aspects of the reform, including amalgamated gramadas and logistics and various other practical things. But I also believe, and not just because I was exposed as one of the consultants on the previous kind of GIZ activities in Ukraine on exactly those particular practical things, that the reform is also an opportunity to look up from only administrative reforms. It's an opportunity to look at the wider transition patterns and wider transition narratives, because in many ways, reform is nothing else, just building a better society. And the question is, of course, what a better society today could actually mean. So in some ways, in many ways, I think fundamental ways, the reform also is and should be about reforming the ways of thinking, the ways how our education system works, and in what ways different levels of the governance can collaborate with the civic sector and with several other societal actors who can actually help with this kind of new ways of thinking and organizing the society. And if that's okay, we can move to the next slide, which for some particular reason, I'm actually trying to see, I don't see the slides on the screen. I'm just seeing myself twice, which is nice to have yourself in stereo. But still, if you can see the slide with the brain, I'm just going to guess it now, what you've seen on the screen. If you see the slide with the brain, it's actually the narratives, the one before the one, please, before that one. It's that when we're talking about the new narratives, we are talking about the new kinds of literacies, as you said, Helge. And I like to think about the new societal narratives in the form of literacies, being literate in new ways of thinking, or the old ways but taught in new ways. And when I say literacies, what do I mean by that? I think that we have to become literate in specific ways to be able to build a newer and better society. And the standard broad education, I believe, is not enough anymore for the modern society and the modern world, because we are living in a really interesting world. It never existed before like that, and there's several factors I would like to talk about that are actually impacting on our minds in ways that we almost kind of never had before. So we have to be aware of that. If we move to the next slide, I believe there are 6 key literacies that we as a society should be start learning properly, and particularly start learning from a very, very early age. So the role of the educational system is absolutely huge here, but also how the society talks to the other stakeholders in that society. One of the key literacies, and for each of the literacies, I think we are largely illiterate at the moment, which means that most of us on a global level are not actually trained, actively trained, to be literate in these forms of thinking, is the archetypal narrative literacy. The modern world is steeped into big stories, into big archetypal stories. And of course, they could be used for very good things in order to, for example, tell a better story about the reform and all the benefits of the reform. It's not just about data and the facts, it's about very often how the facts and the data is being told and very often dramatized so that people can understand the benefits of all of that. But also the archetypal narrative stories can be used against us. And we can see that in modern media, we can see that in a lot of the commercial sphere. The effect and the phenomenon of the fake news, which is so prevalent today, is actually nothing else than activating archetypal narratives in order to influence our feelings first and foremost, and then through that to influence our thinking. So whenever we have the situation us versus them, whenever somebody is trying to pit us, whoever we are, against them, whoever they are, usually they use the archetypal narrative structure. And for me, the bizarre thing is that we are not taught that in our schools and from the very early age, how to recognize those things and how to defend ourselves from those kinds of narratives, which are actually very deep and very often evolutionary based as well. And also we've got a big commercial aspect of that, which is the whole consumption versus sustainability story. And again, the whole of the marketing industry, my former profession in many ways, still kind of in touch with that, but I actively abandoned it after I sort of realized certain things, is that archetypal narratives are constantly pushing us to buy more and to want more. And as you know, the sustainability of the world really suffers. We are literally taking the world to hell in a shopping basket. Again, the whole mythology of the modern commercial sphere and the marketing is based on archetypal narratives. So understanding them, for me, is one of the key starting places for being functional and literate in the modern world. If you can move to the next one, please. The archetypal narratives very often are designed to trigger our impulses. And again, this is another thing we don't learn in school, how to be impulse literate, which means that most of the modern narrative sphere, and again, you've got the commercial and you've got the political side of it, is based on the social sciences that are essentially weaponized against us. There's a huge, vast industrial system in which hugely competent social scientists and practitioners are actually working in very organized ways in order to make us feel and behave in certain ways. I'm not talking about any conspiracy. I'm just talking the whole of the marketing industry, again, is exactly that. How to stimulate different sort of responses that are beneficial for either commercial or political purposes, and very often propaganda purposes as well. So that sort of ecosystem of the weaponized social sciences is something that we are not taught how to resist. And it's very difficult to do that anyway, because most of those triggers are based on various cognitive biases that we have evolved over the hundreds of thousands and millions of years. They are simply hardwired very often in our brains, and it's not very difficult to trigger them. Professor Daniel Kahneman and many others who in the last about 30 years of the development of the cognitive sciences have shown us how the brain, and the mind particularly works more than in the whole of the history of civilization so far, actually have proven how easy it is to kind of fall prey to different cognitive biases and the triggers that actually trigger them. So developing the training for moderating our impulses, so actually training our impulses so that we can control them at least a little bit, becomes a very, very important factor in the modern world. Which leads me to the third one, if you go to the next slide, please. And the third one is, as a consequence of the very concerted effort to influence us via archetypal narratives and triggering and stimulating our impulses, probably the biggest illiteracy in the modern world, and one of the weakest spots that we have, is the thing that I've called the attention literacy or illiteracy, meaning that very few of us know how to control our attention, which is what the cognitive scientists would tell you is a very limited resource at the best of times. But particularly when you live in a society, in a system that is specifically designed to trigger our attention at every possible moment, because attention is the currency that could be monetized in the best way in the modern media sphere. As the people in Google used to say, money follows attention. Then basically this particular literacy becomes really, really important. Why? Because if we are a little bit more literate, we would know how to resist the calls to consume as much content as we can, for example. And this is called, the phenomenon is called digital obesity. And we are most of us digitally obese in the modern digital space, particularly the younger generations who are actually addicted to their screens very often and do show the signs of real being addicted actually to those devices. So it's kind of a big question for the modern society what to do about that. And the second bit of the attention literacy or illiteracy is the algorithmic education. We are surrounded by algorithms. Very often we make a personal decisions and collective decisions based on the results that the algorithms present to us. And understanding how algorithms actually work, and they're not unbiased, they are not agnostic, they are not independent, they always do have a certain aim in them, and that aim is usually commercial, again, would help us manage the works of the algorithms and our decisions based on them a little bit better. And then the fourth one, when we put all of that together, if you can go to the next slide, please, is actually the consequence of all these previous ones. And what do I mean by that? More and more, the modern society actually requires us to work as a team and to work in a team. The whole of the fourth industrial revolution is in many ways predicated on the teamwork of various experts who are working as a unit, and the digital guys in the Silicon Valley are going to tell you that the unit of delivery of almost any project anywhere is the team, it's not an individual. Now we have to be trained for working in a team, we have to be team literate, but that's going to be very, very difficult if we don't have the attention and we can't control our impulses quite well, which means that the teams are not going to be very, very functional. So controlling these things and being trained in those things is one of the best, probably for me at least, platforms for enabling people to prepare themselves for the fourth industrial revolution. This new shift in how our economies and societies are going to work from the economic point of view is going to be based a lot on self-learning. And self-learning without the discipline of attention and without being able to control the impulses of various kinds is not going to be a happy story. And that's why it's absolutely critical to develop it. And also being able to deliver within a team, because our societies actually requires more better teams in various aspects of our lives. The next slide, please. The fifth literacy, and again, surprisingly not being taught in our schools, and I'm literally mean almost nowhere in the world, or at least not properly, is the statistical literacy. Numbers, as we know, are very important in our lives, and what we call science and evidence-based decision-making is based on numbers. But the question is then, what kind of numbers and in what particular context? And here, statistics is very often used to either justify certain actions, justify as the basis for certain stories. But statistics, as you know, could be used this way or that way. So there are three specific literacies regarding statistics that I would like to point out. One is knowing the base. If we are comparing things, if we are trying to compare things in our societies, if we are trying to compare successes, if we are trying to compare achievements, if we are devising trajectories for development, then knowing the real base from where we are starting is an incredibly important thing. Manipulation of the base, as you know, is very often the manipulation of the message. The second statistical aspect is the being able to distinguish and use properly the notions of typical versus average. And here I'm particularly referring to Professor Todd Rose from Harvard, who in his absolutely phenomenal book called The End of Average has really, in a lot of detail, proved that average simply does not work as a measure of anything on an individual level. And at the moment, most of the educational systems in the world are based on measuring the average performance of individual pupils, with absolutely catastrophic results, as we know, for the individuals, but very often for many of the areas of the social and societal development, because we are not measuring the right things, or we are not measuring things in the right particular way. Averages on an individual levels are largely useless. However, typical is not. Typical is not average because of the statistical variations, as we know, and the outliers that can skew the story, but actually focusing on the typical could be more useful than the average. And finally, our notions of probability. Cognitively, evolutionary, we are simply very weak in imagining the probabilities of the future happenings. And that's another training that we require. And think about the social system and the propensity of people to save for their retirement, for pensions. Most of the problems that we have today, why people are not naturally inclined to do that, is because of very, very weak processing of probability in our brains and our minds. And training people from that particular angle, I believe, would help, apart from all the nudges and the behavioral economic things that we also know about, would help actually a lot more people and the society as a whole to envisage the future in a little bit more realistic terms and relevant terms. And finally, the sixth literacy is in many ways the most important. If you can go to the next slide, please. It can literally change the world. Creativity is very often referred to as the God's resource or the ultimate resource. When everything else fails, we as a human species always have our creative faculties to draw on. And literally, sometimes it looks like create magic out of the thin air. But we also need to have an environment that is conducive to creativity. And teaching creativity should be one of the key aspects of any society that actually is thinking about its own future. What does that mean? There's lots of aspects of creativity, and creativity could be defined in so many different ways. But I think there's three specific things that we can put in practice relatively quickly within our education, not just education, but various other societal systems. One is to start rewarding the troublemakers instead of punishing the troublemakers. That concept today becoming much more prevalent in the world of business and education is called neurodiversity. And neurodiversity, now there are business consultancies, recruitment consultancies who are recruiting neurodivergent people. Google, Silicon Valley, similar companies as well have a huge drive about neurodiversity. According to some statistics, about a quarter of all the engineers at Google are on the autistic spectrum. And that actually means that their brains work in a phenomenally powerful ways, in many unusual, powerful ways. And companies like that are trying to actually turn that to their advantage. So reward people who are cognitively different, people who actually do not want to do things in the same old way, people who want to try it differently, people who rock the boat, people who are eccentric, people who are not agreeing. Because very often these troublemakers are the space where innovation actually happens. But in order to do that, people need to be encouraged for that. And also, when we measure the success of our educational systems, we usually try to measure everything. But how about providing some non-assessed time? Having time in our environments and business environments where things are not measured, where the time is dedicated to thinking and feeling. And again, I can draw on many companies in this space who are actually allowing, let's say, at Google again, 20% of their time to spend on things that they believe are going to be interesting projects. Some very often related to the company, but often not related to the company, some pro bono projects and something like that. And people just go and think outside of the KPIs, outside of the OKRs, outside of any other metrics, whatever we call them, that are supposed to be measuring performance. Because as Professor Roger Martin from MIT once said, you cannot analyze your path to innovation. Sometimes you just have to make that leap, and that leap usually comes from creativity. So for me, these 6 literacies are very important new narrative platforms that the society in transformation, particularly at this particular moment in the modern world, should be considering. We can redraw the lines of our administrative areas, but I don't really think that the actual transformational success is going to happen until we redraw the lines in our minds as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lazar. I think this was a very inspiring contribution, criticizing the way we are educating at the moment, criticizing the way we transmit or what kind of competences we prioritize in our day-to-day life and education system. This is certainly also something that's very important for you Lead with Europe, as we also have our major focus on strengthening capacities, human development, and definitely you gave us some food for thought. The sentence which I will probably remember most is rewarding the troublemakers instead of punishing them. If that were true when I was young, I would be a billionaire probably, but I don't know if I did the right trouble or not. So thanks a lot already for this bon mot. Before we start into the question session, I just would like to refer again to the poll which we organized. For technical reasons, the QR code was not shown, but the links were functioning. So we will now share the QR code again, so you can have access to the question we prepared. We take a minute, or not a minute, but a couple of moments, so that you can scan the code and access the poll. And later on, we will take a look at it and see what are the preferences in terms of the various literacies we've learned about. So thanks a lot. And if I may start with one question, Lazar, thanks again for this inspiring input. When I read your article, one quotation really struck me. It says, no one sleeps in front of a voting booth to be the first one to vote in the morning. We do it in front of Apple stores. And I think this is exactly what your article, if I may interpret it in this way, is addressing. It is addressing the way we can defend ourselves against threats or against tendencies that threat our ability to exercise democratic rights and our voice and our agency. So could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the relationship between democracy and your 6 literacies?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an absolutely critical question for this particular debate, because I think that democracy simply can't even survive, let alone advance, if we do not start paying attention to these literacies, frankly. The interfaces, and why is this important? I think that one of the things to start with, we have become really good consumers, but we actually not as good citizens. And that's because the prevalent archetypal narratives of the commercial sphere are simply much, much stronger than anything else that we are facing in the modern world, apart from populism. And populism is just another way to sell a relatively trivial product, but it looks like it's not very trivial. So it's the same mechanism based on archetypal narratives. And we are suckers for it simply because our brains very often cannot resist. Why? Because the system around us has trained us to respond to those kind of narratives. So we have become really good consumers. But as citizens, we are lacking a bit. And this is the imbalance that I believe had to be addressed.
Yes, thanks a lot. And I see that, let's say, here between the lines that you are not really optimistic about us acquiring these literacies in the nearest future. But if I may reflect a bit on the relevance of these literacies to local development and local self-government. I mean, what's happening, for example, in Ukraine right now with decentralization reform is just that we kind of that the local governments are confronting the challenge to be a lot more proactive, to show initiative, to show responsibility and self-control, something you stress also in your contribution. So basically, we have high expectations with regard to them fulfilling kind of effectively the new responsibilities that are being passed down from higher levels of government. How would you kind of initiate, or what do you think is necessary to initiate such process of empowerment, of responsibility, of also creative experimentation with new approaches, something we expect now local governments to initiate?
I believe there's the short term and the long term here. The long term certainly is the redesigning the educational system, of course, is the key thing from the very ground up and from very early years all the way up. But that's a long-term solution. The shorter-term solution is being aware of these needs for these particular literacies, to start imbuing them into various parts of the system, particularly referring to the multi-level governance aspect of it, which means that train people in these kind of ways of thinking, allow people to start applying some of these ways of thinking in what they do. Particularly, start collaborating with different societal actors outside of just narrowly defined governmental structures, to actually allow them to bring some of these literacies into the system. And could be fantastic projects that could be done together with various NGOs and various other societal stakeholders who actually dwell in or are experts in these particular literacies and help us do it together. It also means working with the media, which kind of leads me to the whole kind of that big question of the political economy of the modern media sphere and the political economy of attention, which is basically at the heart of everything, because media can only survive if they monetize attention, and it shouldn't be that way. So the question is actually what kind of a media reform we need as well. All of these things can help drive things in the right direction.
Thanks a lot. I think that you raise a very, very important issue, and as you mentioned, kind of the political economy of media, you termed it. Well, I see that you also wrote the challenges to the status quo is simply too big. So again, a bit, can we manage kind of acquiring these literacies? Can we change the educational system in a way that we can defend ourselves from threats? I personally sometimes have the feeling that, yeah, we are not necessarily improving and acquiring the literacies. Maybe we're even getting more illiterate. Yeah, maybe we're losing literacy. For example, at the moment, facts and research insights are being put into question. Of course, you also mentioned that in the end, it's a matter also of interpretation. But we see the tendency that gut feeling is kind of being accepted as being a fact. So my question is, are we becoming even more illiterate in some dimensions? And
again, you're asking really good questions. It is one of the critical questions. And sad to say, yes, we are, actually. We are because we can see it all around us, of course. And I'm thinking the world overall, not just individual countries, but we are. Simply because these illiteracies have been allowed for too long to kind of run unaddressed. And even worse than that, they've been actively stimulated. So many of the spheres of the modern societies actually have been working to increase these kind of illiteracies instead of trying to mitigate them. And I think that this is one of the crunch moments, not just today, but in the next few years, maybe 5 to 10 years, if you're unlucky, maybe even sooner, that we're going to be seeing some sort of a big moment of waking up, that we need to see, okay, this is simply got to the wall, we need to start changing things. And this is then the question about what should we start changing? And frankly, understanding what the key problems are, where the key problems are coming from. I've done lots of research and lots of thinking about this area, and in a way kind of all goes back to these 6 things. So I believe that we would have to start redesigning the ways that we organize our societies in these ways as well, which are not just functional and not traditional. We have to go into these untraditional, non-traditional narratives and transitional pathways in order to address that particular change. Am I a pessimist or an optimist? Short term, certainly a pessimist. Long term, probably an optimist. And I have to say, I'm not so much kind of optimist in the power of the elites to change this, although we may be surprised, but actually in the powers of the new generations who are political in different ways, who are commercial in different ways, whose notions of meaning of life is different or hugely to slightly different from the previous generations. And I believe that the real change may come when they get the reins of our society. Probably not going to happen very soon.
Yes, I think, well, it is good to hear that you are, in the end, optimistic about the future and about the next generations. Probably the most important question is whether it is too late or not when kind of the next generations are reigning, but we are working hard to also change current generations, of course.
And if I can jump in on that one, Helge, I do apologize. I
no
think
problem.
Ukraine now, because we are talking about Ukraine and the situation in Ukraine, the reform and the transformation, that is an absolutely ideal timing for at least start thinking about this. Simply because there's not a lot of countries in our immediate environment at the moment who are going through this kind of transformation. And seizing this particular moment to just kind of, again, look up from just the administration and look up to the actual societal narratives and the ways how we're going to reform the minds of the country as well. It's the perfect timing, perfect moment to start at least thinking and even experimenting with some of these things, because experiments are relatively quick and relatively cheap and certainly can kind of start proving the principles that we are talking about here. Some of these things are going to be quite difficult to measure short term. They are usually long term, longitudinal kind of generational things. But short term, we can see within a few years, we can see some of the initial kind of indicators whether this is going in the right direction or not. And that should encourage us to keep going.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, experimentation is surely something we need at the moment. The big question again is here if we can accept failure then as well. Yeah, so we need also to be prepared to have a failure culture and in the end to deal with the consequences.
Absolutely. I mean, in some of the companies in the West, particularly again, Silicon Valley, and it's not a coincidence that these guys are kind of reigning over us at the moment. FAIL is an acronym, actually, as a positive acronym. It's defined as the first attempt in learning. All
right. Okay. This is, I'm learning, and definitely you converted something rather negative in something rather positive. Thanks a lot for that. This is exactly what we expected from this conversation. We have some results from the poll, and I would like to take a look now at the results of the question. Aha, and okay, unsurprisingly, I see a strong leader here, but please, I pass the floor to you. What do you see?
Yes, absolutely. It's not surprising to me, actually, that these two are quite high, and the algorithms as well, simply because they reflect our reality, but also other societal debates that we have. But you can't have creativity without having the ability to disagree. You cannot have creativity without being able to control your impulses in a way. But also, on the other hand, knowing how to recognize, how to master the archetypal narratives, because very often creativity is being able to create a new powerful story as well. Not just kind of inventing a technical thing, but even that can come from a new powerful narrative in your head. So I think that these are the things that we're discussing a lot and are familiar to a lot of people. I think that the very first one actually is the most dangerous one if we don't address it. That's my take on it. We are not even aware how archetypal narratives work on us and how they reflect the evolutionary traits that we have and the various cognitive biases, how they triggered almost completely automatically. And for me, one of the key things that we should start teaching kids from very, very early on, how to resist archetypal narratives, how to spot them, how to deconstruct them, how to actually pick them apart and even resist. And if you remember in Harry Potter films, we had something called the defense from the dark arts. This is what we are talking about here.
Thanks a lot. Yes, there you're saying something very important. I think that our defense capabilities, this is something where I also see that in the future we need to invest a lot. So thanks a lot. I wanted to address one last issue with you. You mentioned also as one literacy, the teamwork literacy. Which even when I was decades ago in school was stressed a lot, but I still encounter it that, you know, teamwork is still something that is kind of something new to certain contexts, even sometimes myself. If we now talk about decentralization reform, here it is not about individuals cooperating, but about institutions cooperating. So my question is, how can we promote cooperation between not individuals, but institutional setups that have their life of their own, that consist of individuals, of rules and norms? And how can we then, of course, make it relevant also to kind of the decentralization reform in Ukraine, where we need cooperation between municipalities, but also levels of government? So how do we get, you know, institutions to work together?
Thank you very much for that. Can I just kindly ask you how much time do we have before I answer the question?
We have just a couple of minutes left, 2 to 3 minutes.
Okay. First of all, I always vote, let's kind of start building the institutional culture that is going to say, how can we have as much neurodiversity in decision-making that we can? Meaning moving away from the group think and moving closer to the neurodiverse thinking, which means introducing in the teams that are exploring particular societal issues or want to make a decision on certain things, people who are just coming from those areas, understand those areas, but are quite different from us. Which means various non-political actors, various academic actors, various NGO, civil sector actors, and so on and so forth. People who are simply not part of the system, as we call them. And we have to welcome those people. The traditional impulse of the system is to reject those guys. Why? Because they're rocking the boat. So it's a cultural issue more than anything else, that a culture needs, at least needs to start being created, that we invite all these other guys to help us explore the issue and then start making slightly more creative and slightly more different decisions. And actually on all possible levels of the governments, I would say the whole thing goes. That would also kind of include collaboration, would be a little bit easier between the higher levels and the lower levels, simply because you've got the connective tissue, which is the people from the outside of the system without the hierarchical notions and things like that they have to follow, sometimes subconsciously, but actually people who just kind of want to suggest certain new way to do things. And these guys tend to be kind of hierarchy independent. Maybe that could be one of the ways.
Yes, I would agree. It will be a challenge. I mean, myself as a political scientist, the first rule I learned was when I joined the bureaucracy, you stand where you sit. So you defend the position of your location, of your post, and breaking up these kind of norms and these structures will definitely kind of require some substantial effort. So Lazar, thanks a lot for this conversation. I think it was extremely inspiring. I think all of those who listened today, when they open YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, they will think about the algorithms behind, they will think about the attention, what we are paying attention to, what our attention span is. They will think about averages or typicals or medians or other, all the different dimensions you have mentioned. So it was really a very kind of eye-opening conversation and speech and input from your side. Thanks a lot on behalf of YouLead, on behalf of the entire audience. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing you also in person and discussing these issues with you further. Thanks a lot.